this record-setting fine? What right do bureaucrats have to overrule our judicial system? This is a multi-million-dollar fine we're talking about, the largest penalty ever handed down by the Education Department. I want to repeat that. This issue has already been settled in federal court. I reserve.
Reserves. Gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized.
I continue to be opposed to this as amendment, but we keep hearing about Grand Canyon University, 86,000 students online. I would once repeat that the nonprofit, but they deal with for-profit companies, and what they do is they are ripping off students, ripping them off. That's something that we need to really take a very hard look at, because they are predators with young people. They make a ton of money, and they don't provide the services, the education, or the opportunities for employment after that. There are people here who are all over these so-called nonprofits who are really in league with profit-making companies that are raking in tons of dollars at the expense of our students. I oppose the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it's interesting that my colleague on the other side says that Grand Canyon University is ripping people off. If that's the case, why didn't the 11th Circuit Court find GCU guilty? That's not what happened at all. My colleague on the other side of the aisle is not the judge, the jury, okay? Like I said, the 11th Circuit Court already found GCU innocent. My colleague also said that there's only 87,000 students at GCU. There's 118,000 students because of their innovative approach to higher education. We are very proud of this. We are very proud of this college in Arizona. I reserve.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from... The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
I demand a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona will be postponed. The chair understands that amendments number 93 through 95 will not be offered. It is now in order to consider amendment number 96 printed on Part B of House Report 118-272. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 96, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-272, offered by Mr. Good of Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 864, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This evening, I rise in support of my amendment to ensure that no funds will be used to require universities to enforce COVID vaccine requirements for students and faculty. My amendment is important for two reasons. First, because many universities, unbelievably so, but they are still actively mandating COVID vaccines for their students. There are students who, mind you, that were never at any serious risk of the virus. At the start of the 2023-24 school year, there were still nearly 100 universities in this country that required a COVID-19 vaccine to attend their university. Think of that. It's been about 4 years since the China virus first came to the United States. And the federal government finally declared, however, the pandemic just back in May of this year, finally declared the pandemic was over, although for many of us, the remediation efforts were over as soon as we realized what we suspected, that the masking up and the vaccine requirements were exploited by a bureaucracy that was trying to impose their will on normal Americans. Yet so many universities are still forcing students who have likely already contracted COVID at this point. Everybody's had it by now, right? Many of whom never were sick or with symptoms, and all of whom recovered. But in the event that they were any serious risk to begin with, didn't matter. They were required to take a vaccine that they didn't need and didn't want. The second reason this is important, my amendment to be supported, is to preemptively check the government's authority, a government that has sadly broken the trust of the American people on this and many other issues. Over the last 3 years, we've seen this government push so many unconstitutional vaccine mandates for healthcare workers, those you know who treated us during the height of the virus, for government employees, for members of the military, the armed forces who were discharged for not getting a vaccine, for law enforcement officers, for first responders, and lots of other regular Americans and workers across the country. In fact, the Biden administration is still spending money to promote the COVID vaccine. And they have a program to pay for the vaccine for uninsured Americans through the end of next year, the end of 2024. We cannot assume that because the pandemic is over officially, that the anti-freedom vaccine agenda will stop. Students should be free to pursue an education without the government violating their most basic personal freedoms. I now urge all of my colleagues to support my amendment, and I reserve.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I claim the time in opposition.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. This amendment prohibits the use of funds to require any institution of higher education to enforce any COVID-19 vaccine mandate. First, second or third time I've repeated this. Let us be clear. There is no federal requirement that any institution of higher education put in place a COVID vaccine mandate. Now, the university could easily have their own immunization policy, which is part of their immunization strategy. But no one from the federal government is forcing universities to enforce any COVID-19 vaccine mandate. No one. Now, I find what's really interesting here is that we don't want, I'm told all the time, especially with regard to education, that government should not be interfering with education and educational institutions. They should be doing what they want to do. Federal government stay out. Now, all of a sudden, what we are going to do is prohibit the use of funds to require any institution of higher education to enforce any COVID-19 vaccine amendment where there is no federal requirement to enforce a vaccine amendment. It really is pretty preposterous here. But let me just step back. COVID-19 vaccines are safe. They're effective at protecting people from getting seriously ill, being hospitalized, or dying. Vaccination remains the safest strategy for avoiding hospitalizations, long-term health outcomes, and death. COVID vaccination reduces the risk of death by at least 75%. Getting a COVID-19 vaccine is a safer, more reliable way to build protection than getting sick with COVID-19. And for those who have had COVID, vaccines offer added protection against being hospitalized from a new infection. New variants are expected part of the evolution of viruses and can be more aggressive, transmittable, or cause more severe disease than the original strain. Vaccines continue to be our best line of defense. And scientific experts have determined that COVID vaccines to be safe and effective, and hundreds of millions of doses have been administered in the United States. We should not place restrictions like those of this amendment, where we say we do not want to interfere from the federal government. Imagine, we talk about the federal government in curricula. We don't want to do that, certainly, and we don't. But the Republican majority now wants to impose a restriction on institutes of higher education regarding the tools that they view to use in their own best interest to protect the health and safety of their students. Urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It should be chilling to Americans as they watch the resistance to efforts to prevent the federal government from funding and enforcing a vaccine requirement. My friend on the other side said, hey, there is no vaccine requirement. Then why would you not support an amendment that says the federal government cannot enforce or require a vaccine amendment on a college campus? And for that matter, the federal government doesn't require it. How about if we say the federal government cannot require it? That they cannot, not that they don't require it, they cannot require it. We don't permit the federal government to require a vaccine mandate. Why would we even allow that to be an option? Over the last few years, Americans watched their most basic fundamental freedoms trampled on by this federal government. Their right to worship. There's a reason why the beginning of the Bill of Rights starts with the freedom of religion. That's the first one. The right to assemble was trampled upon. The right to travel, freedom of movement, the right to earn a living, to operate your business, to make basic medical decisions for yourself, or even to disclose your own medical information. America is done with tyrannical China virus mandates. Our economy is still reeling from how the government crushed it during the COVID virus and the disastrous policies of this administration. I'm sure if they could, the other side would reinstate mask mandates right here in this chamber and vaccine mandates and all around the country if given the opportunity. I urge my colleagues to support freedom and to vote in favor of this amendment. And I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman is recognized.
I oppose this amendment, and one more time be clear that there is no federal mandate for vaccine. There's no mandate. There's no federal government forcing a university to have a vaccine mandate. You want to vote for freedom? Allow the university to do what it is that it would like. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, virtually all universities in the country are subsidized by federal tax dollars. And I encourage my colleague to join us in ensuring that there will be no vaccine mandate. And I ask all of my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The chair understands that amendments number 97 and 98 will not be offered. It is now in order to consider amendment number 99, printed in Part B of House Report 118-272. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 99, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-272, offered by Mr. Gosar of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 864, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar, a member of the opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As recently as fiscal year 2023, National Institutes of Health has spent more than $10 million of taxpayers to fund virology research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. The funding continues through 2027. This is in direct violation of policy barring funding for such risky research known as gain-of-function research. Despite being dismissed as a conspiracy theory, mounting evidence proves that the coronavirus originated from a leak at the Wuhan lab. It is estimated that 7 million people across the globe have died from the coronavirus. Nearly 3 years have passed since the first case of COVID-19 was detected, yet the NIH continues to fund experiments in the China lab that created the deadly virus. The fact that the United States continues to fund dangerous experimentation in the country of our greatest foreign adversary is unacceptable. My Amendment 104 would prohibit funding for virology research by the National Institutes of Health in Southeast Asia. Not another dime of federal taxpayer dollars should be used to create a bioweapon for our enemies. Even Barack Obama wanted a pause on this. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and with that I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I claim the time in opposition.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. The amendment would block funding for 2 research grants funded by the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH. NIH grants are funded after a vigorous peer review process to identify the most promising research proposals. In this case, the congressman from Arizona has identified research grants to study bat coronavirus as well as zoonotic virus emergence in Southeast Asia. Given the global impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, I would argue that we really do need to understand more about bat coronavirus, as well as zoonotic virus emergence in Southeast Asia. But I will tell you, I'm not in the medical profession. I'm not a scientist. I believe in the research. I believe that we need to take a look at things, given what we have heard anyway. And again, I'm not a scientist, but I believe in research. And we need to understand more about bat coronavirus, zoonotic virus. Coronaviruses and zoonotic virus are not going to disappear if we stop funding research. Why are we research deniers? I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment.
Does the gentlewoman reserve?
Yes.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I find it fascinating, absolutely fascinating, in regards to the science. Not a scientist? Well, I do deal in science quite a bit. In fact, the Wuhan virology lab didn't even qualify for what it was doing with virology. Didn't even qualify by the standards set by international standards. And yet we're still going to do that? I got to tell you, something's wrong with this deal. Even Barack Obama, I want to reiterate this, Barack Obama actually stated that this should take a pause. But he was overrun by people at NIH at the time. Now, I believe that we ought to be looking all the time at different things. But gain of function is totally different. This is building a bioweapon. We got to stop this. And with this, I still reserve.
The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentlewoman is recognized.
I continue to oppose this amendment, and I say to my colleague, just keep your head in the sand. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Once again, I find it very fascinating. Keep my head in the sand. What about the science? You know, hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin weren't going to work? Are you kidding me? You know, from that standpoint, you know, who's got their head in the sand is the other side. This is very important that we stop this. We shouldn't be dealing with somebody else. If we're going to do something like that, it ought to be done here, not in Southeast Asia where we can't control it. Once again, I ask for all my folks to support this bill, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 100, printed in Part B of House Report 118-272. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 100, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-272, offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 864, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Graves, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment is a simple amendment. Earlier this year, as part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, we enacted for the first time ever an administrative pay-go. We put a provision in place that said if this administration is going to try and put regulations in place that cost in excess of $100 million, then they have to offset those costs, meaning they have to rescind other regulations to offset that cost on American taxpayers. Therefore, the net cost would be zero. If you're going to put $100 million in new burden requiring regulations in place impacting American households and businesses, you have to rescind $100 million worth of regulations on American families and American businesses. This amendment takes it next level. Look, when our constituents elect us to office, they expect us to be here representing them. Yet, during this administration's first 2.5 years, they attempted to put additional cost or heap additional burden to the tune of $1.5 trillion on American taxpayers. Mr. Chairman, I want you to think about that for just a minute. It is effectively the President of the United States, one person, unilaterally spending $1.5 trillion. That's effectively what we're going to spend in discretionary spending this year. And one person doing it without any action by the Congress. So what this amendment does is it says that it's fine. If you want to put regulations in place, that's fine. But if you're going to propose something that's going to cost over $100 million, it has to come to Congress. It has to come before the representatives that were elected by the people to approve it or shut it down. And so I think this is a simple amendment. It is complementary to amendments that have passed to 3 other appropriations bills. It's complementary to what President Biden signed into law earlier this year on the administrative pay-go. I urge adoption of the amendment and reserve.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I claim the time in opposition.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I would just say to the gentleman, my colleague, friend, I will refer to my earlier remarks on a similar amendment from the Congresswoman from Florida. This amendment would bring Medicare operations to a standstill. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. And I'm hoping that the gentleman will make good on a muffaletta. Thank you.
Does the gentlewoman reserve?
Reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly, being a representative that represents thousands and thousands of seniors, I would never do anything that would adversely affect Medicare. As a matter of fact, I would argue that this actually helps to protect Medicare. As we all know, the solvency of the Medicare Trust Fund is in jeopardy. And so by being more efficient, being more judicial with the limited dollars that the trust fund has, this is actually a step in the right direction. And let me be clear on what I'm saying there. If the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services is going to try and impose a new regulation that's going to cost additional dollars in excess of $100 million, all that would happen under this regulation, Mr. Chairman, is that regulation would then come to Congress for an approval before it would be implemented. It doesn't stop it from happening. It simply ensures that it's consistent with the wishes of the American people. So this does nothing to jeopardize Medicare. It does nothing to impede or prevent services to seniors. We all represent thousands and thousands of seniors, and I certainly would not do anything to jeopardize that care. So with that, again, I urge adoption and reserve.
And gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I oppose the amendment and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to reaffirm that Louisiana does have the best muffalettas in the United States. I'd be happy to have this conversation in depth with my friend from Connecticut. With that, I'm going to say that we should support this amendment, and I'll yield back.
Muffalettas.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 101, printed in Part B of House Report 118-272. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 101, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-272, offered by Ms. Green of Georgia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 864, the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Green, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My amendment prohibits funding for the promotion, implementation, or enforcement of the CDC's recommendation to add the COVID vaccine to the child and adolescent immunization schedule. In the fall of 2022, the Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices voted to recommend that the CDC add the COVID vaccine to the child and adolescent immunization schedule, despite having zero scientific evidence for such recommendation. This decision recommended that children as young as 6 months get the COVID vaccine and accompanying boosters. In direct contradiction to the science, the CDC officially implemented the recommendation earlier this year. All studies showed that young children were far less likely to be infected or hospitalized by COVID. Between August 1st, 2020 and August 21st of 2021, the CDC reported that less than 1% of kids' hospitalizations for COVID resulted in death. Less than 1%. Children comprised less than 0.01% of COVID hospitalizations and 0.0005% of deaths, according to the CDC study. Why would the CDC implement such a recommendation to knowingly inject an experimental shot, especially one that is not even fully FDA approved, into kids who have an almost 0% chance of dying from COVID? Now we see that the side effects of the unapproved experimental vaccine are proving to be detrimental to children and are causing irreversible injuries. 9 days after receiving the vaccine, a 6'9", healthy 17-year-old Everest Romney was admitted to the ICU with blood clots in his brain. Anyone who talked about the incident on social media was censored. 9 months later, he was admitted for a second time. Doctors found another blood clot, a deep vein in his right leg, and potentially permanent heart inflammation. Now, he can no longer play basketball and he has to take blood thinners. Thank God he is still alive. Stephanie DeGaray's now 15-year-old daughter was in the Pfizer COVID vaccine trial and is now in a wheelchair with vision problems and a feeding tube. Several groups on Facebook were even taken down after she tried telling her story. Dr. Cody Meisner's chief of pediatric infectious diseases at the Tufts Children's Hospital in Boston said, "It is hard to deny that there's some event that seems to be occurring in the terms of myocarditis. Although the CDC does not have the authority to officially mandate the vaccines for kids, the CDC's recommendation to add the vaccine to the child and adolescent immunization schedule is the foundation for all the vaccine mandates for kids in schools, daycares, sports leagues, and extracurriculars. My amendment would protect children from the experimental shot by blocking the implementation of the baseless CDC recommendation. I urge all of my colleagues to support my amendment, Mr. Chair, and at this time I yield my time.
The gentlewoman yields. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I claim the time in opposition.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. This amendment prohibits the use of funds to implement, promote, or enforce the recommendation of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to add the COVID-19 vaccine to the child and adolescent immunization schedule of the Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices. This amendment would set a dangerous precedent for Congress to overrule the scientific process used in determining eligible vaccines for children. The amendment would interfere with the work and purpose of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practice, CDC's Federal Advisory Committee, which develops recommendations on the use of vaccines in the civilian population of the United States. The Advisory Committee is comprised of medical and public health experts who make recommendations that include the ages when the vaccine should be given, the number of doses needed, the amount of time between doses, and precautions and contraindicators. Before recommending any vaccine, the advisory committee considers many factors, including the safety and the effectiveness of the vaccine. CDC sets the U.S. adult and childhood immunization schedules based on these recommendations. The COVID-19 vaccine has already been added to the CDC immunization schedules based on recommendations from the advisory committee. This amendment would undermine CDC's ability to engage in its ongoing immunization work, including the safe and effective COVID-19 vaccines. Kids may be less likely to get COVID, but why wouldn't we want to continue to protect them? And we need, for immunity's sake, we need to protect the entire population, to be able to protect everyone. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman has the only time remaining.
My time. Okay. I oppose this
Gentlewoman
amendment
is recognized.
with the interference with the really the scientific process that's used in determining eligible vaccines for children, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Georgia. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. It is the opinion of the chair. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 102, printed in Part B of House Report 118-272. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 102, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-272, offered by Ms. Green of Georgia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 864, the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Green, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My amendment prohibits funding for the enforcement of any COVID vaccine mandate. This includes every agency under the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Labor, and the Department of Education. During COVID, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration implemented unconstitutional, tyrannical vaccine mandates for businesses with more than 100 employees. This mandate applied to 84 million workers. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services implemented the same tyrannical mandates for healthcare workers. Thousands of healthcare workers were unjustly fired for refusing the experimental vaccine, many of whom were from my district in Northwest Georgia. The Department of Education also put out recommendations and guidance for schools to require students to get vaccinated. Furthermore, the federal government has spent more than $30 billion on the COVID vaccines, including incentivizing their development, guaranteeing a market, and ensuring that these unsafe vaccines would be free to the public. But they weren't. The American taxpayers were forced to pay for them. Big Pharma was the only industry that benefited from these mandates. From 2020 to 2021, Pfizer saw a 95% increase in earnings, while businesses all over America were shut down and crushed. In 2020, Pfizer's revenue were $41.6 billion. In 2021, Pfizer's revenues were $81.3 billion, doubling the year before. In 2022, Pfizer's revenues hit a record of $100 billion. That is outrageous. And Americans suffered, people lost their jobs, and businesses were forced to close. As we know now, the experimental vaccines have been detrimental to Americans and have caused irreversible injuries and, in some cases, death. In just 15 months after the vaccine rollout, approximately 1,400 peer-reviewed articles documented severe adverse events after the COVID-19 vaccinations, a concerning safety signal not even rivaled by combining all other vaccines in the worldwide medical literature over the last century. There have been approximately 1 million adverse events resulting from the COVID vaccine reported in the VAERS system, which includes everything from myocarditis, blood clots, permanent disability, miscarriages, stillbirths, menstrual abnormalities, and more. The following shows significant increases in various diseases and medical conditions among service members who were forced to take the vaccine. Hypertension, 2,180% increase. Disease of the nervous system, 1,048% increase. Malignant neoplasms of the esophagus, 894% increase. Breast cancer, 487% increase. Female infertility, 472% increase. These are just to name a few. Historically, a vaccine is subjected to an average of 10 to 12 years in clinical trials before it's authorized to be administered to the general population. Under an emergency use authorization, these vaccines were available to the public as early as 10 months after development. Mandating such a vaccine is a complete abuse of power, and no American should be forced by the federal government to have any experimental shot injected into their body. Our Secretary of Health and Human Services, Xavier Becerra, said it is absolutely the government's business to know whether and which Americans have not been vaccinated. He also previously said, absolutely, the message is clear. You're vaccinated, guess what? You get to return to more normal lifestyle. If you're not vaccinated, you are still a danger, and you're still in danger as well, so get vaccinated. These vaccines are not safe and effective as the American people were told. COVID is over. Not only has Congress passed it, the president himself signed it. And no one should be forced to take a vaccine. My amendment prohibits the enforcement of any COVID vaccine mandate, and I urge all of my colleagues to support my amendment. Mr. Chair, I yield my time.
Gentlelady yields. No, reserves.
Reserves. Sorry. Reserves, thank you.
Time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Connecticut seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I claim the time in opposition.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I rise in opposition to the amendment. This amendment prohibits the use of funds to enforce any COVID-19 vaccine mandate. Okay. One more time. Let's be clear. There is not a COVID vaccine mandate in place. I will repeat. There is not a COVID vaccine mandate in place. COVID-19 vaccines are safe and effective at protecting people from getting seriously ill, being hospitalized, and dying. Vaccination remains the safest strategy for avoiding hospitalizations, long-term health outcomes, and death. COVID vaccination reduces the risk of death by at least 75%. Getting a COVID-19 vaccine is safer, a more reliable way to build protection than getting sick with COVID-19. And for those who have had COVID, vaccines offer added protection against being hospitalized from a new infection. There are new variants that are expected as part of the evolution of viruses, and those can be more aggressive, transmittable, or cause more serious or severe disease than the original strain. Vaccines continue to be our best line of defense. Scientific experts have determined the COVID vaccines to be safe and effective, and hundreds of millions of doses have been administered in the United States. Our nation's public health officials need to have options to protect our communities as we continue to live with COVID. We should not be limiting the use of our most effective public health tool. This amendment would set a dangerous precedent for Congress to overrule the scientific process. Although many people would like to act that COVID is over, it is not. More than 1 million people have died due to COVID in the United States. We all have lost someone. But why isn't it understandable, in terms of some of these amendments, that there is no COVID vaccine mandate in place? So what are we speaking about here? I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields. The question is now on the amendment offered by gentlelady from Georgia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 103, printed in Part B of House Report 118-272. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mrs. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk would designate the amendment.
Amendment number 103, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-272, offered by Ms. Green of Georgia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 864, the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Green, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mrs. Chair. My amendment uses the Holman Rule to castrate the salary of Assistant Secretary of Health Richard Levine to $1, the same way he supports castrating children who suffer from gender dysphoria. Richard Levine was a diversity hire by the Biden administration to push the demonic gender-affirming care agenda, and he is unfit to serve as the HHS Assistant Secretary for Health. He should never have been hired after he, serving as Pennsylvania's health secretary, directed nursing homes and care facilities to take in COVID patients while simultaneously pulling his mother out of her own care facility. Dr. Levine has spent his career focusing on treating, let's say, grooming children, adolescents, and young adults. He now serves as a top advisor for our nation's health policy while masquerading as a woman. A mentally ill man who thinks he's a woman should never be responsible for overseeing anything in the Department of Health and Human Services, let alone the Office of Women's Health. This same man who is empowering kids to mutilate and castrate themselves under the guise of so-called gender-affirming care said that he was happy to have waited to transition genders so that he could have kids. Oh, what a complete hypocrisy. He has promised that mutilating and castrating kids will soon be normalized and that it has the highest support of the Biden administration. He has stated that sex reassignment surgery and puberty blockers for kids are life-saving, medically necessary, age-appropriate, and a critical tool. He also said there shouldn't be state laws and actions that dictate principles of transgender medical care by us pediatric experts, illustrating why we need federal protections like my bill, the Protect Children's Innocence Act, for our most vulnerable and innocent children. It is our job to protect our children from sexual groomers like Levine, and reducing his salary to $1 is a strong first step. He has infiltrated our Department of Health and Human Services with guidance and curricula that further his perverted agenda. The Office of Population Affairs, which is directly overseen by Levine, put out guidelines encouraging our youth to seek gender-affirming care. These guidelines discussed how and why our youth should seek puberty blockers, as well as top and bottom reassignment surgeries. Let's be real, that's cutting off their body parts before they're adults. Our initiatives and guidance he has issued include a cultural competency curricula. This cultural competency curricula is for behavioral health and primary care practitioners to assess, treat, and refer LGBTQ clients in a culturally appropriate manner. Part of his curricula is for nurses to focus on teaching cultural competency in the care of LGBTQ older adults. Another part of this curricula includes utilizing the National LGBT Health Education Center for its educational programs on how to best meet the learning styles, needs, and time constraints of LGBTQ people. And last, additional part of this cultural competency curricula includes a training specifically designed to help both administrators and clinicians address the various aspects of providing effective substance abuse treatment to LGBTQ people. Obviously, they should be cutting off their body parts as children. The training covers such topics as legal issues, the coming out process as it relates to behavioral health, how to make a provider organization more LGBT welcoming, and more. Another agenda Levine has been pushing for is the vaccination of children. Just recently, he was calling on parents to speak up and defend vaccine requirements at schools, saying they need to be part of back-to-school checklist of an emergency use vaccine that children do not even need. Our mentally ill Assistant Secretary for Health is more concerned with woke gender and vaccine agendas than serving the everyday health and needs of the American people. He deserves to be fired immediately. This man is a danger to all children and should not be serving in our government. Mrs. Chair, I urge all of my colleagues to vote yes to my amendment, and I reserve my time.
The gentlelady's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Connecticut seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I claim the time in opposition.
You're recognized.
Thank you. I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. Public servants should be commended and not demonized. Our federal government needs talented, intelligent, hardworking people who are willing to bring their skills, their expertise, their compassion, their experience to public service. Proposing to eliminate the salaries of hardworking public servants is petty and is beneath the dignity of this body, and is not how we should solve differences of opinion on policy. Admiral Levine, I repeat, Admiral Levine is the head of the United States Public Health Service Commissioned Corps. That is one of the 8 uniformed services in the United States. A physician. She completed her training in pediatrics and adolescent health at the Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York City. The focus of her medical career has been the intersection between mental and physical health, particularly for children and for adolescents. Imagine the knowledge, the expertise, the study, the commitment of Admiral Levine. And given the ongoing mental health crisis in this country, particularly with children and with adolescents, I am grateful and in awe of her expertise and of her service. And prior to joining the Biden administration, Admiral Levine served as Pennsylvania's Physician General and Secretary of Health. My God. What a background. She is highly qualified for her position, and I want to tell her tonight that I commend her efforts to improve the health of Americans across this country. But let's be honest, the Congresswoman from Georgia submitted this amendment to target the salary of a transgender health official. It is As simple as that. It is ugly, it is disgraceful, and I ask whomever is watching and the American people and everyone in this body to note the date and the time when the Republicans in the House of Representatives have hit a new low. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this vindictive amendment offered to target the salary of a qualified transgender health official who has the expertise and the knowledge to address health issues in a way that many in this body are unable to do. I urge my colleagues vote no on this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady has only time remaining.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields. Now the question is on the amendment offered by a gentlelady from Georgia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Madam Chair.
For what purpose?
I demand a recorded vote.
All right. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings and the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Georgia will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 104, printed in Part B of House Report 118-272. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Georgia seek recognition?
Mrs. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 104, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-272, offered by Ms. Green of Georgia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 864, the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. Green, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Georgia.
Thank you, Mrs. Chair. My amendment uses the Holman Rule to reduce the salary of Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona to $1. Miguel Cardona is unfit to serve the American people as Secretary of Education. He is complicit in allowing biological men to compete against women in labeling parents as domestic terrorists and in implementing critical race ideology in schools. His Department of Education issued a proposed rule on Title IX to set out a standard for how schools must adopt sex-related criteria that would limit or deny a student's eligibility to participate on a male or female athletic team consistent with their gender identity. Under this proposed rule, schools would be prohibited from adopting a policy that directly bans all transgenders from participating on athletic teams that correspond to the gender they identify as. If schools were to implement such a ban, they would be subjected to intense litigation. This department's proposed rule not only makes a mockery of women's sports, but it also perpetuates the radical agenda that biological differences should not be weighed against the emotions of confused men. This proposed rule will destroy women's sports. He has stated, sports does more than just put ribbons on the first, second, and third place winner. Fully acknowledging that biological men will dominate women's sports when they are put on the same playing field as women. Miguel Cardona is also complicit in Merrick Garland's memo directing the FBI and DOJ to target parents who were considered domestic terrorists for speaking out at school board meetings. Internal emails between the National School Board of Association's Secretary-Treasurer and a member of a school board in a Washington school district revealed that Secretary Cardona requested for the NSBA to write a letter to the White House to provide supporting information for why parents are domestic terrorists. This letter sent on September 29, 2021 from the NSBA to the White House said that disruptions by parents at school board meetings posed a threat of domestic terrorism. Don't forget, these people are paid by the parents who are the taxpayers. The letter suggested that parents who object to mask mandates and critical race theory are engaging in a form of domestic terrorism. A week later, Garland issued a memo directing the FBI and DOJ to target parents, citing the contents of this letter as reason for such. Miguel Cardona was one who requested that the National School Board Association write this letter to the White House. Prior to serving as the Secretary of Department of Education, Miguel Cardona implemented the nation's first mandate, statewide CRT curriculum in Connecticut. Critical race theory is a destructive, racist ideology that promotes black supremacy and teaches that America is fundamentally racist. It is not. He is now pushing the same CRT agenda across the nation's school system by attempting to implement CRT curriculum in schools and into grant-making process. After enough pushback, he said that the department will not dictate or recommend the curriculum to be taught in classrooms. However, the department is still encouraging projects that incorporate racially, ethnically, culturally, and linguistically diverse perspectives in classroom instruction. While the department claims it no longer requires grant recipients to incorporate CRT into its curriculum, they are still explicitly pushing for it in the grant application process. Secretary Miguel Cardona's actions are destroying our nation's school systems. He should be fired immediately, and I urge all of my colleagues to vote for this amendment. Protect our kids. This must be done. Thank you, Mrs. Chair, and I reserve my time.
The gentlelady reserves. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Connecticut seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I claim the time in opposition.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. Again, public servants should be commended and not demonized. Our federal government needs talented, intelligent, hardworking people who are willing to bring their skills to public service. Proposing to eliminate the salaries of hardworking public servants is petty, and it is, yes, beneath the dignity of this body, and it is not how we should solve differences of opinion on policy. I suspect that folks could challenge members of Congress on their views and their opinions, but yet they don't have the ability to threaten our livelihoods. Maybe they should have the ability to threaten our livelihoods. Proposing to eliminate the salaries of hardworking public servants is really a stain on this institution. In Connecticut, and I know Secretary Cardona well, Secretary Cardona is well known for a career as an educator, a passion and dedication for students and teachers, a commitment that has now been on full display nationally. You know, when he first joined the department, students and families were facing unprecedented change and disruption to their education. With his leadership and investments made by Congress over the past several years, including the American Rescue Plan and the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, schools now have the resources to strengthen teaching and learning in our classrooms. Under his leadership, schools can better support student academic recovery, address mental health needs, and tackle nationwide teacher shortages. Those are the issues. We need his steady leadership at the helm of a vital agency that oversees our investments, our federal investments in public education. But let me take a second to make a comment, Madam Chair. We are now less than 4 days away from a government shutdown. Instead of focusing on keeping our government open, we are working on a bill that is going nowhere. This is a bridge to nowhere for sure. The harmful funding cuts proposed in this bill and the ugly amendments that demean this body and this institution are on full view. This is not regular order. What we should be doing now is to have the allocations for each of the appropriations subcommittees. We should do what was agreed to by the former Speaker of the House in the budget agreement. And we should be moving toward passing appropriations bills that will provide the services and the resources to the American public in agriculture, in education, in health, in transportation. We should be dealing with the issues of national security which face us today. We should be dealing with the international crises which face us today, which are going begging, about which we are doing nothing. This is an unbelievable waste of time and an exercise in futility with the overview of an ugliness that once again demeans this institution. This is the Congress of the United States. And we are here tonight making petty and vindictive, introducing petty and vindictive amendments that demean the individuals who hold these positions and, once again, demean the dignity, the stature of the United States House of Representatives. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this vindictive amendment, and I yield back.
The gentlelady's time is expired, and Gentlewoman from Georgia is now recognized.
Thank you, Mrs. Chair. My Democrat colleague across the aisle, who's 80 years old and has been here over 30 years, just said we're on the verge of a shutdown. She probably just forgot that a few hours ago she voted for the continuing resolution that will extend the budget, and we are not on the verge of a shutdown. So I just wanted to note that for the record. I also urge my colleagues to vote for my amendment. We should pass this Holman rule. We need to protect our kids. No males belong in women's sports and schools, and parents are not terrorists and never should be recommended that way.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you.
Madam
For
Chair,
what purpose does gentlelady?
I rise to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'm very well of the rule of the vote that we took earlier this evening. It may be that the gentlelady doesn't know that there is another body attached to the U.S. Congress called the United States Senate, and they have to vote on a continuing resolution. And when they vote on it, we'll find out what it is that they do with regard to this continuing resolution passed by the House, which, quite frankly, is flawed to a fare thee well. Flawed to a fare thee well in meeting our obligations, both domestic and international. And by the way, it isn't a law of the land or done until the President of the United States signs it. That may be a basic level, a lesson in civics. There is the House, there is the Senate, and there is the President. And quite frankly, the budget agreement that had been signed by the President for a basic primer in civics is that the budget agreement passed the House overwhelmingly, and it passed the Senate, and it was signed by the President. It's the law of the land, which my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have dismissed, walked away from, and quite frankly, don't understand the process of government, an unwillingness to govern and an inability to govern.
The lady yield.
Yes, I yield back. I'm sorry.
Thank you. The question is now on the amendment offered by a gentlelady from Georgia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Madam Chair,
Yes, for what purpose do you stand?
I demand a recorded vote.
Okay. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by a gentlelady from Georgia will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 105, printed in Part B of House Report 118-272. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Wyoming seek recognition?
But at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 105, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-272, offered by Ms. Hageman of Wyoming.
Pursuant to House Resolution 864, the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I rise today in support of my amendment number 105, which prohibits the Department of Labor from providing so-called climate literacy training. In September 2022, the Department of Labor released a, quote, climate adaptation plan. This plan identifies the department as the agency that developed the climate training and discloses that it is exploring collaboration with other agencies for the purpose of promoting climate literacy training. Madam Chair, this climate literacy training is yet another example of the extent to which radical climate hysteria has permeated every agency and sub-agency within the Biden administration. The Department of Labor's mission statement actually says that it is responsible to foster, promote, and develop the welfare of the wage earners, job seekers, and retirees of the United States, improve working conditions, advance opportunities for profitable employment, and assure work-related benefits and rights. Perhaps it would be a surprise to the Department of Labor, but creating a, quote, climate adaptation plan is not listed as either part of the agency's mission or priorities, yet here we are. It is time for the Biden administration to stop catering to a politically radical agenda and actually focus on governing. It is time for the Department of Labor to focus on its mission of fostering, promoting, and developing the welfare of the wage earners, job seekers, and retirees. The purpose of my amendment is to ensure that the Department of Labor does just that it focuses on its true mission and leaves the politics of global warming out of it. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment to send a message to the DOL that we will no longer tolerate its foray into this nonsense. And with that, I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I claim the time in opposition.
The gentlewoman is now recognized.
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. This amendment blocks a critical aspect of the Biden administration's whole-of-government strategy to build resilience at home and abroad against the impacts of climate change. And with that, Madam Chair, I oppose the amendment and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields.
Since President Biden took office, the American worker has suffered a 3.1% pay cut, caused in large part by this administration's obsession with all things climate change and its war on affordable energy. The dramatic increases in energy costs have translated into higher costs for everything else, including food, housing, clothing, entertainment, and travel. This administration's war on affordable domestic energy has thus dramatically and negatively affected the very people that the DOL was created to serve, the American worker. In short, American energy independence is good for the American worker, but the converse is also true. Dependence on foreign-produced energy is bad for the American worker, yet that is the very outcome of these wrong-headed programs such as the DOL's climate literacy training. Such training won't improve the lot of the American worker, it will hurt it. Last year, U.S. inflation-adjusted household income fell by the most in over a decade. This reduction in income is the direct result of the inflationary pressures caused by the Biden administration's energy and climate policies. These policies have also impacted our labor force participation rate, which remains low and has never fully recovered since the pandemic. There are serious labor issues to address in this country, and while I would argue workforce development and job creation are not a role of the federal government at all, so long as the Department of Labor exists, it should be focused on how it will work with American industries to foster a strong labor market. And with that, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and with that, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by a gentlewoman from Wyoming. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 106, printed in Part B of House Report 118-272. For what purpose does gentlewoman from Wyoming seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 106, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-272, offered by Ms. Hageman of Wyoming.
Pursuant to House Resolution 864, the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of my Amendment 106, which prevents the Department of Labor from carrying out the environmental justice grant activities described in its 2022 Climate Adaptation Plan. Similar to my previous amendment on climate literacy training, this is climate change political capture inside the agencies of the federal government. Since taking office, President Biden has issued several executive orders directing federal agencies to address climate change and environmental justice, whatever that means. The DOL has been very busy in implementing that directive, and in the process, it has deflected resources away from its mission and wasted taxpayer dollars on trying to implement the Green New Deal. With its climate adaptation plan and environmental justice, grant activities just being part of those efforts. The fact is that we don't need any such plan, and the justice that the DOL is peddling isn't justice at all. It is government-imposed wretchedness dressed up with nonsensical language, the very purpose of which is to pursue an agenda that has never been approved by this body. I encourage my colleagues to vote for my amendment, and with that I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose? Does any member claim time in opposition?
Sorry.
For
yes,
what
Madam
purpose
Chair,
does
I
the
claim the
gentlewoman
time in
from Connecticut
opposition.
seek recognition?
Yes, I claim time in opposition. Thank you. I
Gentlewoman
rise in
is
strong
recognized.
opposition to this amendment. This amendment blocks another critical aspect of the Biden administration's whole of government strategy to build resilience, both at home and abroad, against the impacts of climate change. And it's my understanding that this amendment would prohibit, let me give it an example. The agency highlighted certain grants provided under the Workforce Opportunity for Rural Communities and Clean Energy Sector apprenticeships provided through the bipartisan Youth Build program, but that would be blocked. It's wrong to block the Department of Labor from common sense grant making intended to build skills in the clean energy sector for rural workers and for at-risk youth. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields.
While the workforce...
The gentleman from Wyoming seek recognition?
Yes, thank you. While the Workforce Opportunity for Rural Communities does fund rural grant opportunities, this amendment would simply prevent the Department of Labor from infusing environmental justice priorities into the program and return its focus to building economic opportunity for rural Americans. In other words, it uses the money the way that it should. My amendment would block using money for things that it should not be using it for. While the Youth Build program does on face value sound like a beneficial program for development of vocational skills, the 2022 Climate Plan outlines how skills can be developed for demand in industries, including the clean energy sector. The reality is that it is a misapplication of funds and it is being used inappropriately. When outlining its so-called environmental justice work, the DOL's climate plan references a strategic investment, but such waste of resources isn't an investment at all. It is a colossal waste of taxpayer money. Madam Chair, the Department of Labor is dedicating limited resources, manpower, and money towards implementing the left's climate change agenda, while the very American citizens on whose behalf it is supposed to be advocating, the working man, lose ground every day. With inflation eating away at their buying power, individuals having to give up on work, and intergenerational government dependency being some of the fallout related to those policies. A vote for my amendment is a vote for sending a message to the Department of Labor and any federal agency engaged in pushing radical climate change initiatives. It is time for the DOL to focus on the job the American people expect it to do. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by a gentlewoman from Wyoming. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 107, printed in Part B of House Report 118-272. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Wyoming seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 107, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-272, offered by Ms. Hageman of Wyoming.
Pursuant to House Resolution 864, the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming.
Madam Chair, I rise today in support of my amendment number 107, which prohibits the Department of Education from carrying out strategies listed in the department's report titled Strategies for Increasing Diversity and Opportunity in Higher Education. In June 2023, the Supreme Court, through the decision in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, rightfully ended affirmative action and processes related to the admission of students into higher educational institutions based upon racial factors. This landmark case has finally ended affirmative action, an agenda that its supporters lauded for maintaining equity and inclusion, but what was actually founded upon, implemented, and pursued for the purpose of furthering racial discrimination. As Justice Roberts has previously said, the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. I agree. That, however, is not the way that the Biden administration sees it. The Biden administration and the Federal Department of Education don't seem to care what the Supreme Court says and have every intention to continue implementing programs that directly violate the fair admissions decision. The current federal education department has done what agencies like this do best. They release a report that, while having no force and effect of law, provides a roadmap for colleges and universities to effectively continue their race-based admission practices. The Federal Department of Education, in other words, is simply continuing with its race-based discrimination, just calling it by another name. My amendment is designed to block the Department of Education's efforts in that regard, and I encourage my colleagues to vote in favor. With that, I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. Any member claim time in opposition?
Madam Chair, I claim the time in opposition.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I rise in opposition to this amendment. This amendment blocks suggestions and recommendations from a report by the Department of Education to ensure that college is available to all Americans who wish to attend, not just the wealthy, not just the privileged. In this report, the department has identified promising practice based on evidence that institutions can consider. Many of these interventions or practices have already been shown to be successful at other institutions or states. The types of strategies this amendment seeks to undermine are essential to expanding diversity and opportunity in higher education. Enjoy broad, bipartisan support. Strategies like supporting K-12 college counseling, why not? Providing emergency and need-based aid, why not? Supporting transfer and community college partnerships, why not? Instead of proposing amendments like this that would harm students, I hope my colleagues across the aisle will join me and the Department of Education. Let's expand educational opportunity for all Americans. Let's have a literate, educated society. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
This report, released in September 2023, describes the strategies that colleges and universities may use to continue their discriminatory diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda by suggesting that admission procedures include a holistic review of student candidates, emphasizing such factors related to their experiences with hardship, including racial discrimination, sources of inspiration, and demonstration of resiliency, and other qualities with clear racial undertones. Let me be clear, admission practices and professional recruiting standards are areas in which merit should be the sole and primary focus when selecting new candidates. My amendment prohibits the Department of Education from carrying out its strategies listed in the department and report and ensures compliance with the Supreme Court's decision. I urge my colleagues to vote yes, and with that, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The question is now on the amendment offered by a gentlewoman from Wyoming. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 108, printed in Part B of House Report 118-272. For what purpose does gentlewoman from Wyoming seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 108, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-272, offered by Ms. Hageman of Wyoming.
Pursuant to House Resolution 864, the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Hagman, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of my Amendment 108, which prevents the Department of Education from carrying out its, quote, American History and Civics Education priorities referenced in the Federal Register entitled Proposed Priorities, American History and Civics Education. Under this 2021 proposed rule, the Department of Education sought to institute a variety of priorities under the National Activities Program and within American History and Civics Academies, seeking to promote a divisive educational curriculum. The real agenda behind these priorities is to attack our nation's history and pursue an agenda to allegedly address what it refers to as, quote, systemic marginalization, biases, inequities, and discriminatory policy and practice, and to allegedly help students understand their own biases when reviewing information. What complete and total hogwash and drivel. While the department was forced to abandon its efforts to institute its offensive agenda, it has also disclosed its intent to maintain what it refers to as invitational priorities, meaning that it will encourage others to do what it cannot. Madam Chair, our children deserve to be educated on history, mathematics, English, science, and other programs that are accurate, robust, educational, and that will prepare them to join the workforce and be productive members of society. They do not deserve to be indoctrinated into far-left hatred of America. My amendment would block the Department of Education from instituting these insidious priorities. I encourage my colleagues to vote in favor of it, and with that I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
I claim the time in opposition.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I rise in opposition to this amendment. It seeks to block priorities for an out-of-date civics competition from 2021. My colleague seeks to gin up alarm over the prospect of federal funding being used to support priorities that alarm her. She failed to mention how the department ran an entirely new civics competition in 2023 that used different priorities from the 2021 competition. The department has no current plans to reuse the 2021 priorities that she speaks about. Let me just tell you, our children need to know about civics. We have children today who know nothing about government, at the local level, the state level, the federal level. They don't know how to interact with one another with differences of opinion, and the lack of knowledge about civics has created more division in our society than almost anything else. We need to invest in civics, and I know that because I've introduced legislation in a bipartisan way on having civics taught. Let's not create a specter about what civics education is and define it in your terms. It's good to have an educated society that understands what our government is about and how we can interact with one another and have agreements and disagree in an agreeable way with one another. In the end, this amendment was drafted to conjure up unwarranted fears and concerns. It will have no impact. It is another waste of our time. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields you that the members should only refer to the chair. Okay, your remarks to the chair. Now, the gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
As I have said numerous times before, critical race theory and related programs are simply a mechanism utilized by the radical left to assert their control and to further divide Americans. Madam Chair, my amendment is one small effort in combating the left's effort to turn our educational system into indoctrination camps, pushing racist policies that are not grounded in reality. Once again, my constituents are fed up with the failures of the Department of Education in actually educating our children while using our taxpayer dollars to destroy America from within. Support for my amendment will send a message to the Department of Education and other federal agencies who pursue implementation of critical race theory initiatives that their time is up. that we are no longer going to allow them to use our educational system to implement policies that are not only based on lies, but that pit Americans against Americans. I urge my colleagues to vote for my amendment, and with that, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by a gentlewoman from Wyoming. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 109, printed in Part B of House Report 118-272. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I rise as the designee for Mr. Harris of Maryland and have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 109, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-272, offered by Mr. McCormick of Georgia.
Pursuant to House Resolution number 864, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. McCormick, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise to offer amendment number 109, limiting indirect costs paid by the National Institutes of Health to a maximum of 30% of the total grant awarded. Indirect costs are simply known as overhead costs. These costs are not directly attributable to the research and project or function. These costs include facility operations and maintenance, depreciation of buildings, and administrative expenses. In 2021, the National Institutes of Health spent $6.7 billion on indirect costs racked up by grant recipients. Meanwhile, the top grant recipients were universities sitting on multi-billion-dollar endowments, nonprofit organizations that provide research funding, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Alzheimer's Association, and the American Heart Association, cap indirect costs at 10%. Congress has historically limited indirect costs for agricultural research to a maximum of 30%, which is included in the Agricultural Appropriations Bill. I propose that we apply this limitation to the National Institutes of Health research to ensure taxpayer dollars are being spent responsibly. I urge all members to consider supporting this common sense amendment, which would dedicate more research dollars to direct research costs. And I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I claim the time in opposition.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment. This amendment would cap the facilities and administrative costs for NIH awards at 30% of the cost of the award. About 6 years ago, in October of 2017, the Labor HHS Subcommittee held a hearing on this topic. And in a bipartisan way, we invited 4 experts who represented research institutions across the country, in Connecticut, in Oklahoma, San Francisco, and Seattle. The consensus from our expert panel that morning was that a proposal by the Trump administration to place a cap on indirect costs for NIH awards would have a sharply negative impact on research. Our expert panel outlined the critical importance of indirect costs to their world-renowned research programs and the harsh consequences of establishing an arbitrary cap on indirect costs. Dr. Bruce Liang, Dean of the University of Connecticut School of Medicine, outlined the many research-related costs that are covered under the guise of facilities and expenses, or indirect costs. He described the facilities and administration costs as, and I quote, the shared expenses related to the building and use of research facilities and the administrative backbone functions that make such places run, end quote. Dr. Liang noted that the facilities and administrative reimbursements pay for, quote, building, depreciation, and maintenance, shared equipment, academic library materials, departmental administration, office supplies, and grant oversight activities, such as pre-award applications and hopefully post-award work, end quote. He concluded by saying that F&A costs are absolutely critical to funding the academic medical centers and research facilities operating efficiently. The expert panel noted that the American Association that the Association of American Medical Colleges, the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, and the Association of American Universities all oppose the proposal to place an arbitrary cap on indirect costs for NIH awards. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
Objection. The amendment is withdrawn.
Thank you. Why? It's okay. It's
Now, in order to consider amendment number 110, printed in Part B of House Report 118-272. For what purpose? Gentleman from Oklahoma, seek recognition.
Madam Chair, I rise in support of my Amendment 110.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 110, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-272, offered by Mr. Hearn of Oklahoma.
Pursuant to House Resolution 864, the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Chair, through the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, the Chinese Communist Party has been spreading its malign influence over the last decade. This initiative has one goal: to increase China's economic and political dominance over the United States and the world. Disguised as harmless global infrastructure, transportation, and production networks, the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI, is anything but harmless. Education is one of the primary targets of the BRI, and they're succeeding in their mission to indoctrinate American students with their communist ideals. Chinese state media even brags about the success of Confucius Institutes and other educational initiatives in spreading the CCP's influence. This doesn't stop on our college campuses. Right now, China is invading our K-12 schools through Confucius classrooms. Over the last decade or more, the CCP has infiltrated our public school system and setting up Chinese language and cultural programs in primary and secondary schools. These Confucius classrooms are funded by the Chinese government, both directly and through Confucius Institutes and other third parties. Make no mistake, this is not through the kindness of their hearts. The CCP is not interested at all in helping American students learn Mandarin. They want to brainwash our children, plain and simple. Since 2013, the authoritarian government of the People's Republic of China has sent curriculum and PRC-trained teachers into hundreds of K-12 schools across America as an unofficial component of its global influence campaign. The CCP has committed countless violations of human rights, and its authoritarian agenda is antithetical to the democratic principles of our country and what it was founded on. Chinese propaganda has no place in our education system. We have taken important steps towards mitigating Chinese influence in American universities by cracking down on Confucius Institutes. Now that the Chinese government has directed its attention toward elementary and secondary schools, it is time we do the same, protect our children from the malign influence of the CCP. My amendment would prevent federal funding for these Confucius classrooms. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Does any member claim in opposition?
Claim the time in opposition.
Okay, the gentlewoman is recognized.
I rise in opposition to this amendment. In the past few years, most of the institutes that are targeted, as I understand it, by this amendment, or Confucius classrooms that are affiliated with them have closed down. And according to the data from the Congressional Research Service and the National Academy of Scholars, we know that compared to 2019, when there were over 100 Confucius Institutes nationwide, there are now only a handful that operate in the United States, between 7 and 10. So they're not still operating. And given the rate, they may continue to plummet. But I'm struck by this amendment by exaggerating the threat and the proliferation of these kinds of classrooms. it seems to be spreading misleading information that creates fear. And the fear that's caused by these exaggerations lead to harm toward Asian American students and teachers. Now, to be honest, I don't know, and I would like to examine this, but they were teaching the Chinese language, Chinese culture. It may be where there were learning experiences, and I don't know the answer to that. I just know that this does not appear to be a difficulty, and I worry about spreading misleading information that creates fear. We have all seen in these areas what happens when fear and misinformation is spread, and it has resulted in violence against Asian American students, Asian American teachers, which is not something I believe my colleague would foster. I certainly don't want to, or that colleagues want to foster. Honestly, based on the available data, I think we can conclude that this amendment does not address any measurable threat to our system of public education, and quite honestly, is not being offered in good faith. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Madam Chair, I appreciate the chair lady recognizing that these institutions are closing down in record numbers. It must be that they're so successful that we're identifying these, and the school systems are identifying these, and states now have cleansed out a lot of their higher education Confucius Institutes. That tells you right there that the Chinese government has been very persistent in getting after educating our younger students across America. We should have more love for our students at our secondary and elementary schools. Again, higher ed across America has understood the influence that the Chinese government has tried to do in making their impact on American economy. When you see what they've done across the world, it doesn't take a whole lot of research just to simply go look at Wikipedia, if you'd like, to see what they've done across all the nations across the world as they try to express their influence and take over the world. It would be very naive of us, and I know the chair lady knows this, it would be very naive of us to sit back and allow this to happen one school at a time. We have a lot of other issues in America we need to address in our education system, and not allowing the Chinese government to take over our elementary schools will simply be a very easy fix for us, and that's what my amendment does, and I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. This gentlelady from Connecticut seek recognition.
I'm really quite troubled with this, and I need to express this. It seems to me that what is happening here with the amendment is that it seems to incite, again, misinformation and fear. I don't, quite frankly, don't know if there is any evaluation or tangible results of what the effect of the Institute or the classrooms were and are. They seem to have gone away. I think of it in these terms. My family are immigrants from Italy. And if, you know, there were teaching about the Italian culture, teaching the Italian language, and again, I don't know. I really now piqued an interest in trying to look and investigating what we're talking about. But that what would happen, would there be this view that somehow the Italian government was taking over and somehow brainwashing our kids or taking our kids down a wrong path. We seem to be casting aspersions with this amendment on Chinese culture and education in the guise of the Chinese government. And I suspect that that has a chilling effect, and quite frankly, you could say this about any cultural group or ethnic group who was working with youngsters in our community. And so I find this amendment to be very, very troubling, more so than I ever thought. And I think we have discerned no measurable threat to our system of public education. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
With all due respect, Italy is not trying to conquer our nation. The Department of Education and the Department of State have sent a letter to schools urging them not to participate in these programs. Confucius classrooms have been set up in several countries, including Australia and Canada, where state and local governments have canceled their contracts over concern of Chinese propaganda. With all due respect to my chair lady on the other side, we're not talking about simply teaching language. We're talking about teaching the Chinese way of how to take over a government from the inside out. We see enough of what's coming across the southern border and not knowing who's here. Well, we have the ability to control these issues through the legislative process. We should take our time to do that. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oklahoma. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 111, printed in Part B of House Report 118-272. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 111, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-272, offered by Mr. Hearn of Oklahoma.
Pursuant to House Resolution 864, the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Madam Chair, I rise in support of my amendment number 111. Almost 3 years ago, Congress passed the No Surprise Act to protect patients from surprise medical bills. A key provision in the No Surprise Act is to provide patients with an explanation of benefits in advance. It's straightforward. It's a cost estimate. If a patient books a health care appointment with adequate notice, they deserve to know a cost estimate for their services before they get care. This amendment reinforces the need for the Biden administration to implement this provision. We're going on 3 years here and no progress has been made. Last week, all of my Republican colleagues on the Ways and Means Committee and I sent the third oversight letter to the Biden administration demanding that we follow the law. It is an absolute failure of this administration to delay implementation of this technology. Considering American families' current economic struggles, anything to help with financial planning should be a priority. Knowing how much health services will cost removes some anxiety patients face when seeking medical care. Patients are nervous about their test results. There is no reason for the added anxiety of not knowing how much a service will cost them too. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Does any member claim time in opposition? That's not. The gentleman from Oklahoma is again recognized.
I'd like a recorded vote, ma'am.
Okay. Would the gentleman yield your time back?
Yes, I yield.
Okay, the gentleman yields. The question is now on the amendment offered by a gentleman from Oklahoma. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Madam Chair, I'd like a recorded vote, please.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by a gentleman from Oklahoma will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment number 112, printed in Part B of House Report 118-272. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 112, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-272, offered by Mr. Higgins of Louisiana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 864, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of Amendment 112 of House Rules Committee print of H.R. 5894. Amendment 112 reduces the salary of Mr. Christopher Williamson, Assistant Secretary of the Mine Safety and Health Administration, to $1. This measure reflects our concern over the leadership under which questionable enforcement actions occurred. This is a call for accountability at the highest levels. Madam Speaker, and I encourage my passionate and brilliant colleague from Connecticut to consider my words. This chamber was built to reflect the highest ideals of individual rights and freedoms. The birth of our nation, as envisioned by our founder, included balance of powers built throughout our government. In this chamber, where we stand in the People's House as one half of our bicameral Congress, we are the legislative branch. We are held accountable by elections, in extreme cases, by censure or by ejection from Congress. Our judicial branch is filled with judges that are appointed, reviewed, and confirmed by our Senate and held to the highest standards. Our executive branch, at the highest levels, are accountable by election and in egregious or extreme circumstances by impeachment. But the bureaucrats, Madam Speaker, and I say to my colleagues respectfully across the aisle, the bureaucrats of the executive branch are hardly accountable save for by action through the power of the purse by Congress. We have not only the right to exercise the power of the purse, to do things like contract the salary of a rogue executive employee who has abused their authority and thwarted the will of the people. We have not only the right to do so, we have the obligation to do so. Reducing the salary of a bureaucrat regulator who has abused their authority is a shot across the bow of oppression. And I've listened respectfully to my colleagues oppose every amendment of the Republican majority. And I asked her to respectfully consider how else, Madam Speaker, might we control oppressive actions of rogue, abusive bureaucrats from within the executive branch. They are implanted within our government, an army of bureaucrats, virtually unreachable by standard business procedures, very difficult to fire or dismiss, insulated by many layers and levels of civil protections. Reducing the salary of a regulatory agent, employee of the executive branch, is an effective and constitutionally sound mechanism to control oppression. Madam Speaker, I rise in support of Amendment 112. I ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
Madam Chair, to claim time in opposition.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. This amendment once again demonstrates the lack of seriousness of this process and the lack of seriousness by my Republican colleagues. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. Gentleman is recognized again.
Madam Speaker, how much time do I retain?
45 seconds.
Madam Speaker, do I appear to be anything less than very serious? This is a serious body. I come from a humble background. I know what it is to earn a dollar or not. I rise in support of this action because it's the right thing to do. I encourage my colleagues to support my amendment. I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question is now on the amendment offered by a gentleman from Louisiana. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Madam Chair.
Gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized.
I demand a recorded vote.
All right. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by a gentleman from Louisiana will be postponed. Okay. It is now in order to consider amendment number 113, printed in Part B of House Report 118-272. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 113, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-272, offered by Mr. Higgins of Louisiana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 864, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to speak in favor of Amendment 113 of House Rules Committee print of H.R. 5894. Amendment 113 reduces the salary of Mr. William Odell, the district manager in Dallas, Texas, of the Mine Safety and Health Administration. This action is in direct response to his failure to address the conflict of interest concern raised by my constituent Morton Salt, demonstrating a significant lapse in supervisory responsibility and a willful neglect to perform his duty. Madam Speaker, as I stated earlier, it is our obligation as sworn servants to we the people to protect the individual rights and freedoms of our citizens. And when an executive abuses his authority in our government, he must be held accountable. This obligation sometimes falls upon the shoulders of Congress, and the mechanism, the legal and constitutional mechanism that we have devised in this body, the People's House, to hold a rogue executive employee, bureaucrat, regulatory agent accountable for actions beyond the pale of defense. The mechanism that we have at our disposal and readily available is the power of the purse. Every effort by the Republican majority and conservatives amongst our party and our conference, every effort to employ the Holman Rule to contract the salary of an executive employee that has betrayed their oath and abused their authority, every single effort has been thwarted in this House. And it is good, Madam Speaker, that the people take note and that historical record documents the votes of the members of this body, because we too shall be held accountable. The founders hold us accountable every 2 years by design, where a servant in this body could be quickly removed if we do not comply with the will of the people, if we do not always strive to protect the individual rights and freedoms of the people, if we do not uphold the oath that we've sworn. Madam Speaker, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support Amendment 113, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I claim the time in opposition.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Just to note, this federal employee is a non-political civil servant, but I'll say what I said before. I believe what this amendment demonstrates is a lack of seriousness of this process that we're engaged in here tonight, and a lack of seriousness of my Republican colleagues in this House. I oppose the amendment, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by a gentleman from Louisiana. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Madam Chair?
so far. Hey there, guys, we got you. Sure. Copy. Yeah, that's right, Colleen. You can see this World War II era hangar here in Tustin continuing to burn. It's been smoldering for the better part of the last week or so. In fact, almost exactly a week ago is when this fire started. There have been occasional flare-ups. We understand this has been going on for much of the day, but unlike most fires that reignite, this one is not being fought. The decision has been made to let the structure burn to the ground, which obviously has caused some air quality concerns in the area, but you can see what remains of this Tustin Marine Corps station is now burning to the ground. Reporting live from Air 7 HD, I'm Chris Christie, ABC 7 Eyewitness News.